Hey guys, good morning. Welcome to week number 5, lesson number 10 for Jack London's The Call of the Wild. For homework last time, I had you guys finishing chapter 6 and writing a brief subjective summary on it. And chapter 6 was pretty awesome. Chapter 6 was pretty awesome. We got to see Buck's true love for John Thornton, his new master. And I want to briefly talk about the relationship between John and Buck. It's interesting to me that Buck had a relationship with Judge Miller in the very beginning of the book, which we didn't know much about, but in a minute I'm going to speculate about. Then he had a relationship briefly with his captors on the train, which was not very good. He had a relationship with one of his breakers, the first person who introduced him to the club, which was horrible. He had a relationship with Francois and Perrault, which wasn't too bad. Then a relationship after that with the Scotsman, which was pretty difficult amount of work. And then, but the Scotsman wasn't horrible to him. And then a couple of other people who drove him. And then eventually a relationship with Hal and Charles and Mercedes, which was just awful. And he's eventually rescued by John Thornton, who he has the relationship with now. Now, I'd like to speculate about the relationship with Judge Miller. Based on the little bit of contextual information that we've gotten about Buck's time at the Santa Clara residence, we can probably assume that his relationship with Judge Miller was one that was a little bit estranged. The two of them didn't seem to spend... Sorry, hold on, let's let my cat out. Go ahead. Here you go. Okay. The two of them, Judge Miller and Buck, didn't seem to be particularly close. There's no real serious mention of their closeness. And it seems like Judge Miller was this sort of vacant, ambiguous leadership figure in Buck's life that macromanaged Buck's ability to exist pretty freely inside of a societal-based world, right? A society-based world. And then, so Buck went from here in the society-based world being pretty free and allowed to exist in society as a society dog, to all of these arduous experiences transitioning from society to the wild. And throughout those experiences, he became more and more and more imbued with the nature of the wild. And then he's now in this, and I would say those masters and those experiences were down here, right? They weren't as pleasant or as free as the one that he probably had with Judge Miller. And then now he's with John Thornton, who I think is the flip side of the same coin of Judge Miller, only rather than being society-based, John Thornton, I believe, is based in the idea of wilderness. And so we have Buck here with the climactic master of his journey into the wild, being representative of that same vague macro-managing figure who allows Buck to exist in a wild way. So Buck now, I think, is in his final transition into the wild, and that relationship allows Buck to really explore who he is as a wild dog, who he is as an individual, and as I said in a lesson a couple of videos ago, gives Buck the ability to become introspective and allow all of the changes that he'd gone through physically to finally catch up metaphysically. That would be mentally and spiritually and emotionally and those things. Buck's character is now one that is highly wild, that is completely engrossed in the nature of non-civilized society in the Yukon, and John Thornton is a really pleasant master to deal with. Chapter 6 is great because Buck gets to show his love for John Thornton, as well as enjoy all of the pleasantries of being a very strong, very respectable leader-style dog in the Yukon. Really cool at the end of chapter 6 when Buck pulls that 1,000-pound sled, wins a lot of money for John. And now in chapter 7, it looks like they're going to go on a journey. So we're running down to the last 20 or so pages of the book, 15 actually it looks like. So we're going to pick up and start reading and find out what happens to our friend Buck now that he's almost fully transitioned into the wild dog that the titular representation expects him to be. So let's dive in. If you want to follow along, go ahead and click the link in the description below. It's right below. It says click this link in order to follow along with today's reading. Go ahead and click that link. It'll open up Project Gutenberg, and you can just scroll down to chapter 7 where we're going to begin. Chapter 7, The Sounding of the Call. When Buck earned $1,600 in 5 minutes for John Thornton, he made it possible for his master to pay off certain debts and to journey with his partners into the East after a fabled lost mine, the history of which was as old as the history of the country. Many men had sought it, few had found it, and more than a few there were who had never returned from the quest. This lost mine was steeped in tragedy and shrouded in mystery. No one knew of the first man. The oldest tradition stopped before it got back to him. From the beginning, there had been an ancient and ramshackle cabin. Dying men had sworn to it, and to the mine the site of which it marked, clinching their testimony with nuggets that were unlike any known grade of gold in the Northland. But no living man had looted this treasure house, and the dead were dead, wherefore John Thornton and Pete and Hans, with Buck and half a dozen other dogs, faced into the east on an unknown trail to achieve where men and dogs as good as themselves had previously failed. They sledded 70 miles up the Yukon, swung to the left of the Stewart River, passed the Mile and the McQuestion, and held on until the Stewart itself became a streamlet, threading the upstanding peaks which marked the backbone of the continent. John Thornton asked little of man or nature. He was unafraid of the wild. With a handful of salt and a rifle, he could plunge into the wilderness and fare wherever he pleased and as long as he pleased. Being in no haste, Indian fashion, he hunted his dinner in the course of the day's travel, and if he failed to find it, like the Indian, he just kept on traveling, secure in the knowledge that sooner or later he would come to it. So on this great journey into the east, straight meat was the bill of fare. Ammunition and tools principally made up the load of the sled, and the time card was drawn upon the limitless future. Guys, this rendition of the journey that Buck is now facing is an epitomized version of Buck's wild adventure, right? Buck had only had the adventures of civilization in the very beginning, going on, say, walks with the judge's sons and grandsons. And throughout the story, he's had certain adventures that are slightly immersed in the wilderness or are touched with lovable facets of wilderness. But now he is fully immersed in wilderness, as is his master, John Thornton, who, as it says, is just essentially one with nature. And so we get to see Buck finally realize his true wild potential here. To Buck it was boundless delight, this hunting, fishing, and indefinite wandering through strange places. For weeks at a time they would hold on steadily day after day, and for weeks upon end they would camp here and there, the dogs loafing and the men burning holes through frozen muck and gravel and washing countless pans of dirt by the heats of the fire. Sometimes they went hungry. Sometimes they feasted riotously, all according to the abundance of game and the fortune of hunting. Summer arrived, and the dogs and men packed on their backs, rafted across blue mountain lakes, and descended or ascended unknown rivers in slender boats whipsawed from the standing forest. The months came and went, and back and forth they twisted through the uncharted vastness, where no men were, and yet where men had been if the lost cabin were true. They went across divides and summer blizzards, shivered under the midnight sun on naked mountains between the timberline and the eternal snows, dropped into summer valleys amid swarming gnats and flies, and in the shadows of glaciers picked strawberries and flowers as ripe and fair as any the Southland could boast. In the fall of the year they penetrated a weird lake country, sad and silent, where wild fowl had been, but where then there was no life nor sign of life, only the blowing of chill winds, the forming of ice in sheltered places, and the melancholy rippling of waves on lonely beaches. This, my friends, is the wild. Buck and John Thornton and the other relatively unknown and unnameable members of the group, dog and human alike, have stumbled into a place that is officially untouched by the fingerprint of civilization and civilized society. They are in a place that is completely boundless and free and open to all the things that they wish to explore and do. There's no particular trail to follow. There's no particular itinerary to get accomplished each day that will further any civilized goal. They are simply living and surviving and existing as true to their nature as they can, which is to say, doing those things. I mean, there's no goal, right? As true to their nature as they can means simply surviving. And it's quite beautiful to see all the little gems that they get in the survival in the wild, like, for instance, the strawberries that are just as good as the ones in civilized South society. And through another winter, they wandered on the obliterated trails of men who had gone before. Once they came upon a path blazed through the forest, an ancient path, and the lost cabins seemed very near. But the path began nowhere and ended nowhere, and it remained mystery, as the man who made it and the reason he made it also remained mystery. Another time they chanced upon the time-graven wreckage of a hunting lodge, and amid the shreds of rotted blankets, John Thornton found a long-barreled flintlock. He knew it for a Hudson Bay Company gun of the young days in the Northwest, when such a gun was worth its height in beaver skins packed flat. And that was all. No hint as to the man who in an early day had reared the lodge and left the gun among the blankets. Spring came on once more, and at the end of their wandering they found not the lost cabin, but a shallow placer in a broad valley where the gold showed like yellow butter across the bottom of the washing pan. They sought no farther. Each day they worked earned them thousands of dollars in clean gold dust and nuggets, and they worked every day. The gold was sacked in moosehide bags, 50 pounds to the bag, and piled like so much firewood outside the Spruce Bow Lodge. Like giants they toiled, days flashing on the heels of days like dreams as they heaped the treasure up. There was nothing for the dogs to do save the hauling of the meat now and again that Thornton killed, and Buck spent long hours musing by the fire. The vision of the short-legged hairy man came to him more frequently, now that there was a little work to be done, and often, blinking by the fire, Buck wandered with him in that other world which he remembered. The salient thing of this other world seemed fear. When he watched the hairy man sleeping by the fire, head between his knees and hands clasped above, Buck saw that he slept restlessly, were many starts and awakenings, at which times he would peer fearfully into the darkness and fling more wood upon the fire. Did they walk by the beach of the sea where the hairy man gathered shellfish and ate them as he gathered? It was with eyes that roved everywhere for hidden danger and with legs prepared to run like the wind at its first appearance. Through the forest they crept noiselessly, Buck at the hairy man's heels, and they were alert and vigilant, the pair of them, ears twitching and moving and nostrils quivering, for the man heard and smelled as keenly as Buck. The hairy man could spring up into the trees and travel ahead as fast as on the ground, swinging by the arms limb from limb, sometimes a dozen feet apart, letting go and catching, never falling, never missing his grip. In fact, the man seemed as much at home among the trees as on the ground, and Buck had memories of nights of vigil spent beneath trees wherein the hairy man roosted, holding on tightly as he slept. So Buck's having visions of this hairy man. We can assume that this hairy man is a good characterized representation of the absolutely wild human being. It almost seems like a monkey, right? Being able to swing from tree to tree, and also being comfortable on the ground, having this very keen sense of smell for all of the natural goings-on of the wild. And that, guys, is Buck's call, right? The call of the wild. That's Buck's call to go forward into nature. He's always let man lead him, and so it's only fitting now that the symbol of his transition into a full wild dog is done by that of a manly vision. And closely akin to the visions of the hairy man was the call still sounding in the depths of the forest. It filled Buck with a great unrest and strange desires. It caused him to feel a vague, sweet gladness, and he was aware of the wild yearnings and stirrings for he knew not what. Sometimes he pursued the call into the forest, looking for it as though it were a tangible thing, barking softly or defiantly as the mood might dictate. He would thrust his nose into the cool wood moss or into the black soil where long grasses grew, and snort with joy at the fat earth smells, where he would crouch for hours, as if in concealment, behind fungus-covered trunks of fallen trees, wide-eyed and wide-eared to all that moved and sounded about him. It might be, lying thus, that he hoped to surprise this call he could not understand, but he did not know why he did these various things. He was impelled to do them, and did not reason about them at all. Okay, guys, Buck is losing his decision to reason or to wrestle with the innermost callings of his spirit, right? He's being called into the wild. Generally in society, he would wrestle those callings and be limited or constrained and capitulate to all of the norms of his societal life, whether that was in the South Santa Clara Valley or in the North Yukon, where still some vision of society was reaching itself out and taking hold in the area. Now Buck is in a completely wild place. He is completely free and uninhibited in his chase of whatever wild instinctual cravings and desires he's having. Irresistible impulses seized him. He'd be lying in camp, dozing lazily in the heat of the day, when suddenly his head would lift and his ears cock up, intent in listening, and he would spring to his feet and dash away, and on for hours through the forest aisles and across the open spaces where the heads bunched. He loved to run down dry watercourses, and to creep and spy upon the bird life in the woods. For a day at a time he would lie in the underbrush where he could watch the partridges drumming and strutting up and down. But especially he loved to run in the dim twilight of the summer midnights, listening to the subdued and sleepy murmurs of the forest, reading signs and sounds as man may read a book, and seeking for the mysterious something that called waking or sleeping, at all times, for him to come. One night he sprang from sleep with a start, eager-eyed, nostrils quivering and scenting, his mane bristling in recurrent waves. From the forest came the call, or one note of it, for the call was many-noted. Distinct and definite as never before, a long-drawn howl, like, yet unlike, any noise made by husky dog. And he knew it in the old familiar way as a sound heard before. He sprang through the sleeping camp and in a swift silence dashed through the woods. As he drew closer to the cry, he went more slowly, with caution in every movement, till he came to an open place among the trees, and looking out, saw, erect on haunches, with nose pointed to the sky, a long, lean timber wolf. Okay, guys, we're going to leave it right there in the middle of chapter 7. You have a couple of pages until the end of the book. I don't want you to finish it, okay? I want us to finish it together next week. So I want you to take that portion that I've read and go back over some of the things I've said regarding Buck's transition, his character transition into an animal of societal implications and restrictions to an animal of wild freedom and non-restrictions, right? And for homework, I'd like you to do a little bit of writing about that in your own words, okay? So to be clear, for this week's homework, I'd like for you to write about the transition that Buck has made as a character from the beginning of the book to the place we're at now in the book, in the middle of chapter 7. Please don't write about anything further or how he is at the end. Even if you've read to the end, I'd like instead for you to write from that point, at the beginning of the story, how we know Buck to how we know him now. You can focus on traits of leadership, traits of strength, traits of good-naturedness, traits of adaptation, any of those different things. You can focus on Buck as a powerful animal who is able to overcome any of the odds he's faced. You can also focus on Buck as he transitions from a societal beast or a societal pet to a wild beast. Anything you want to focus on, but I want you to put it in your own words, and I want it to be a minimum of 6 sentences, okay? You can even break this down, if you want, into a timeline where you go dot by dot for important events in Buck's transition. And however you do it, you do have to have 6 complete sentences accompanying the homework, okay? If you have any questions about that, go ahead and shoot me an email. Again, my email is jeremy.brooks@psacademyarizona.com. You can also jump right into any of my Zoom calls And I hold the academic ones every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8:30 to 9 a.m. And I hold the social ones on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 2 to 2:30 p.m. Any of those things are fine if you have any questions, or if you simply complete the homework, feel free to submit it in any of those same ways. Make sure you're still watching the videos and doing the homework. We've got a couple weeks left of school, and every week that you contribute, you are entered into the drawing to get a $25 gift card. So I know you guys want that. There's plenty to spend it on these days. Okay, without anything left to go over, I think we're done for today's lesson. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I'll see you on Zoom soon, and if not, I'll see you in my next video. Bye, guys.